Association of Broadcast Journalists here as we have a conversation with the candidate, Miss Jade Simmons, an independent candidate for president, the 2020 election. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brandon, for giving me the space. I really appreciate it.
So you've got quite the resume: concert pianist, motivational speaker, consultant. As you tell us about you, walk us through your road to concert pianist to the 2020 campaign for presidency.
Yeah. It sounds like a far-fetched trail, but I think like most of us, we have this life that if we look at it, it threw us some pretty wonderful detours. And so whatever started out as our childhood dream, mine was to be a classical concert pianist. And I had the wonderful honor of living that dream out. But, when you start moving and you really start listening to what's happening around you and what's needed from you, if you allow it, you'll begin to evolve into something different. And so there were kind of a series of life-altering events that have got me to this point. As a classical concert pianist in the beginning, I was playing on some of the most incredible stages, all the stages that I dreamed of. And if I'm being honest, I was tired. I was so busy trying to impress the audience. And the way that I got through that was I started telling stories in the middle of these pieces. When I would get done, I would tell a story and then play again. And the audience started falling in love with the stories. And long story, very short, a new career blossomed where public speaking was concerned. I entered the Miss America pageant and became an advocate for youth suicide prevention. At the age of 21, there I was testifying in front of Congress on behalf of mental health funding. Had it not been for that experience, Miss America helped pay for much of my college education. I wouldn't have known that I had a gift to not just speak inspirationally, but speak on issues that could impact various demographics in their greatest moments of need. From there, when I went back to performing after taking a year out of school to be Miss Illinois, I had to speak in up to 4 schools a day. And I was speaking on not youth suicide prevention, because sometimes if you're in a kindergarten classroom, that's not how you talk. You talk about life, a passion for life. And I became very passionate about life and who gets to live it powerfully, and how do we create spaces where more people have access to the best life possible. So that speaking became something very pivotal for me. And then in my concert career, I honestly wanted to see how far I could push myself and my audiences. And today my concerts go from Rachmaninoff all the way to rap, believe it or not. And I celebrate one of the most diverse audiences in the world of classical music. It's given me the nickname of classical music's #1 maverick. But I think it's that very identity of a maverick is what we need now in leadership. We need someone willing to push beyond status quo, bringing creative, collaborative solutions. So I believe it's a new lane of experience entirely that's required. And I didn't take this decision lightly. You can imagine it's not something you just wake up and decide. But for a few years now, I've been looking at what is the next iteration of impact. And I think it's a question every individual has to ask themselves. What is your next iteration that's going to equal greater impact? And as I looked at some of the problems facing this nation, I'm excited to bring different solutions than what have been presented before.
Well, we do thank you for your time today. We're going to be speaking with you here for the next hour, the Houston Association of Black Journalists, a great opportunity for us to further get to know you and your platform. And you say that your experience, as you just walked us through it, it helped you to understand people on opposite ends of the political spectrum, to develop a perspective that you say is solely independent. And in your platform, you use that term specifically. So I want to ask you why.
Yeah, I think we can't afford any more lopsidedness in government. People will say, well, you've never held political office. How dare you run for the highest office in the land? And you should have political experience. I'll tell you, the experience that I don't bring to the table is I don't come to the table with lopsided agendas. I don't come looking to serve only one demographic or only one base. You're looking at someone who is dead set on prioritizing people over profit, over partisanship, and especially over personal gain. And I think the American public wants to know, first and foremost, can we trust this person? We're seeing with COVID-19, you shouldn't have to wonder if you can believe the words coming out of the person holding the highest office in the land. There's so much time lost, so much delay, so much catastrophe caused simply by misinformation and not knowing if we can trust that the person in charge is really speaking and telling us something that's to our benefit. So I believe we live in a time now where we need uncommon experience. So I do push back when people say, do you have the experience? I do. And it's because the type of leadership we need now needs to come from an entirely new plane of experience. It can't be politics as usual.
You know, most candidates say, despite their political affiliation, that they do appeal to the voter who's on the other side. So despite the label and the definition that you gave us, what makes you different?
I think you can always say the proof is in the pudding. You know, I've lived my life, man, in between the lines in so many different ways. I mean, as a classical musician, you can imagine, you know, like so many other young African-American minority musicians, we find ourselves in these audiences where we're the only people who look like us, the only people in our age bracket. And you start to learn so much about what diversity really means. And so, you know, I'm proud of the fact that I have one of the more diverse audiences in that world, because it was a conscious effort not to diversify my audience, but to bring the most diverse version of myself to the room. And what does that attract? And I think leadership attracts, and leadership makes its decisions based on what's best for the people in the room. I knew even with audiences, it was a much better experience if we could diversify what they were coming for, surprise them by something they weren't expecting, and even diversify the people in the seats next to them. It created an entirely different experience that allowed me to use a concert platform, not just to present music, but to create moments for transformation for every single individual in the audience. And I did that in my speaking career as well. I still do that today. A lot of corporations bring me in because they're looking to implement quick transformation. Sometimes I'm only in front of their people for 45 minutes, hour and a half at the longest. Can we create quick transformation that starts with powerful mindset shifts, but ends with people being able to take action they weren't empowered to take before?
Certainly. How do you say that inspirational push for motivational change translate to policy?
Yeah, well, I think policy, first of all, must be inspired. It can't be stale. You know, when we look at even how policy is presented, we see these long reams of paper, i.e. scrolling down on our screens, and our eyes glaze over. Policy must be inspired. It also must represent the value of the people that the policy is for. And so when we begin to investigate policy, what we're looking for in leadership, you want to see how your leader really feels about who you are. Don't tell me out of one side of your mouth that you value African Americans, and then let me hear you talking about them, you know, coming from, excuse my language, shithole countries. Or you can't talk that way. We have to see that your language, your talk, and your walk line up. You can't say that you are for a certain demographic, but then we see in the policies that you're not specifically addressing the needs of those demographics. And so I think policy first is inspired, and it must represent the value of the people that we're looking to implement that policy for.
Most certainly, and we're going to ask you about some of those policy points in a second, as we discussed. But, you know, I want to ask you then, was there one particular moment by one particular candidate or person in office that led you to the confirmation that, yes, I want to run?
I would say it started really at the onset of the 2016 elections. I always knew that in some way I wanted to make an impact that was beyond the individual. You know, I've worked in coaching and love the process of one-on-one transformation. I always knew that it would be even more important at some point in my life to go beyond the impact from one to many, where I'm working with people in an audience. But when I saw what was happening to our nation in terms of our conversation, we no longer have civic conversation. And what that does is it disallows us the opportunity to talk about the toughest issues. If we're not talking about the toughest, most divisive issues, there's no way we're going to solve them. If we're talking around the issues, I know we're going to get to the Arbery case soon today. If we can't call it what it is, then we're never going to solve the issue. You know, so I think we need an era of frank discussion. But in order to have that, you have to have a person who is committed to intelligent conversation and committed to inspiring conversation that's going to actually spark and implement change.
Most definitely. And as we begin to talk more about policy, we look at the latest headlines, the latest unemployment numbers released yesterday for the month of April, confirming the unemployment rate jumped to 14.7%. That's the highest level on record. This is millions of US residents are underemployed or unemployed due to the coronavirus pandemic. The Labor Department reporting some 20,500,000 jobs lost during the month of April alone. So a couple plans there. One would be, what's your plan to fix America's economy as as the language has been used to refer to it? But this with the understanding that there are safety mechanisms that have to remain in place.
Sure. Talking about, of course, economic recovery post-COVID. But we got to start by being honest. The economy wasn't fixed before COVID either. I mean, first of all, even the way that we talk about the health of the economy is backwards. We talk about it in terms of the GDP and the stock market. Most Americans those aren't even relevant conversation points for them. They're thinking about the growth state of their finances, or can they even afford the next trip to the market? So the first thing we have to do is redefine the way we talk about economic health. Economic health should represent what economics is looking like for the entirety of American citizens. Are we all able to afford food, water, and shelter? Point blank. You can't call yourself the wealthiest nation in the world when you have those kinds of deficits. You talk about the unemployment rate. Before COVID, our incumbent president has been saying that this is the best employment numbers we've had. What's not being said is that really what was happening is you had people working 2 and 3 jobs and still not making ends meet. So there was a rosy picture being painted that really wasn't the truth. So first we have to be honest with the American people, which really, I should say, they already know what the situation is, because if you ask them if they feel any richer, they're going to say no. So one of the first things we have to do is reopen safely. Now, I'm saying this really in hindsight at this point because we've already started reopening, and my concern is that we have not done it safely. If we could redo, what I believe should have happened first was we should not have reopened until we could secure 500,000 tests a day. The time that we reopened, we had about 150,000 tests that we were completing a day. Sounds like a big number compared to the beginning of the crisis. But according to health officials, we were far short of that. We should have been at 500,000. I'm not even sure that we're there yet. Why do we need that? Because we have to know who's sick and who's not. Or we're voluntarily reinfecting ourselves and sabotaging our own reopening. Now, what you have to do is not wait until we're opened, not only depend on the jobs that were lost, because I do believe a lot of them are not going to come back. You have to create new economy, new industry right now. I believe we have an opportunity to create an entirely new industry called ongoing emergency preparation. You think about it, nations right now are going to need to restock. Other nations are going to need to restock their stockpiles. So are we. We should be the source of that. We should be reopening factories that have been closed down, employing people who've lost their jobs recently due to COVID, and using those people, training those people to create the products that we need to restock. That could happen right now. What else could happen right now, not after the economy opens, not at the beginning of the next administration, is we could hire 30,000 new people in the area of public health to do testing and tracing. We hear a lot about testing, but we don't hear a lot about the fact that you got to track the people that have been tested to know when they're recovered fully. So right away, you got 30,000 new hires. You can use people in the community to fill those slots. Again, you can rehire people that we actually let off before COVID in the public health department, state and locally. So there's a lot we could be doing right now. I would love to see going further into, let's say, my administration into next year, we have to raise the minimum wage. Why is the federal minimum wage still at $7.25 an hour? That's the same as it's been since 2009. You have 5 states that don't even have minimum wage laws. If we raise the federal minimum wage to $10 right away, instantly, you've got people who have an instant economic boost. I mean, these are things that are long overdue. Congress has talked about these things, but what we keep noticing with the partisanship, Brandon, is that if you have 2 parties whose sole focus is to be opposed to each other, you create a stalemate, and the American people are the ones who are paying the price. While they're tangoing over power, you have American people that aren't being served despite the rhetoric that's going backwards, back and forth. Lastly, let me just say, we have to have an era of partnership. Big corporations have done really well by the American government. We saw that with the most recent stimulus. Why are we not asking more in return from the companies we bail out? Apprenticeships. I mean, they should be rehiring some of the people who've lost their jobs during COVID. They should be training these people to work at these companies. We should be giving more small business contracts. Government contracts should go to more small businesses. They should go to more Black small businesses specifically. So there's a lot that we can be doing that's mutually beneficial. My background is in working with corporations, and I've worked for and with some of the most demonized industries, but the best people in those industries who are people focused. So when we talk about demonization, there's a lot of good to be had from big corporations, from the wealthy. And I think that we just have not incentivized, and we haven't had the right conversations.
So I think you've alluded to the answer to the next question, and that is how do we pay for those social programs if ultimately they are put in place?
There's one that I've been looking at when we talk about income disparity. We hear a lot of talk around the fact that the wage gap is so huge, and we want corporations to do better. But I know that there has been talk about a wealth tax. I think another tax that we need to look at is a tax for corporations that have the greatest disparities between their, let's say, low to median wage earners and their highest earners, their CEOs. You have some companies now that have a 200% difference in income between their median wage workers. 10 years ago, it was more like a 20% or 100% was even out of the norm. And now we're at more than 200%. What if there was a tax on those companies that had the greatest disparity? Now, people want to see that tax money come in to the government and be used in other ways. What if there was an incentive that instead of that just being tax money, that goes back into that company, but it's designated to those lower wage workers? If you want to build a real pathway out of poverty, you've got to pay people what they're worth. And I think you can't just keep saying that's what you want to do and don't create systems that allow that to actually be a reality. And so you'll hear me use the word incentivize a lot, because I believe, especially American people, we do worse when we're managed and told what to do. We work when we see a reward and we're incentivized, and nobody likes to pay taxes. And I think if you allow a corporation to generate their own goodwill by, in this way, incentivizing a way to pump money back into the company, but it goes to the people who need it, the workers who are the reason they're able to attain wealth in the first place. I think that could be something very creative. You could also use that same tax money to fund things like free preschool and free daycare, especially for when you have the poorest workers who are always hitting that catch-22, always hitting that cycle where they get the job, but then they don't have the child care. Right? And they take care of the child, but then they don't have the job. And I know people in that vicious cycle where they're never able to get out of one or the other situation.
I know this kind of speaks to your point in terms of how you see yourself politically, but I'm sure you've heard this before. How do you respond to the immediate counter argument to that sounds that is, oh my goodness, that's a little too socialist for me?
It's wild. During this crisis, nobody talked about socialism. When we were handing money to billion-dollar companies, nobody said this is socialism. When so-called small business companies that weren't really small business got the money before genuine small businesses, we didn't call that socialism. We have a convenience of terminology. And I think those are the things that have to be called on the carpet. We've had socialism for wealthy corporations for a long time. We just haven't called it that. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the end goal? What I've been noticing is people either hear things from a humanitarian aspect. They want to do it because they believe it's the best thing for the people, bleeding hearts, so to speak. And then others who only hear the economic benefit. If we're not funding these programs, if we're not doing things to better our education system, we pay for it down the road economically. So I always say, if you can't find it in your heart to care about the people part of the problem, I dare you to be selfish and care about the pocketbook part of the problem as well. So, I wouldn't use that word socialist for myself, but I think we have to ask ourselves, why do we run to that word whenever we're talking about helping the needy, but we don't use it whenever we're talking about bailing out the wealthy?
It's you bring up a fascinating point, just how ultimately language is used to ultimately define, but in its attempt to define, also confuse to a certain extent what ultimately the message may very well be.
I think, one of the number one things we're going to need in the next president is clear, powerful communication. It's one of the reasons that I offer myself proudly in that sense. Make no mistake, communication is going to be crucial. We're going to have to be able to communicate with all types of people from varying viewpoints, with varying agendas. I'm a woman who has grown up, like I said, between so many lines. And what that has given me the gift of is to be able to hear between the lines of what's really being said, to see between the lines of what's really being written. And I consider myself someone who reads people very well, and I'm able to understand what we really want and what we really mean when we say what we say. And so communication is going to have to be done so effectively, to not just to the American people, but to other governmental leaders. We look at how misinformation and miscommunication has handicapped even our recovery during COVID. We weren't able to communicate effectively between states. The head of the UN said it's been a travesty, our communication between nations. And so we've cost ourselves time. The only way we beat COVID-19, really beat it and put it behind us, is as the United States, one nation. We don't beat this divided and partisan.
Let's talk about that. Just the overall response from a political perspective that to this global pandemic, COVID-19, and that debate that came to the fore. What's considered a state right versus a federal right, in terms of how we respond to this. Where do you stand in responding to the matter?
I think from the beginning, you always have to have a strong national response. You remember that upheaval, I think when Jared Kushner said something like, the stockpile belongs to us. And everybody was like, well, who's us? If us is not the American states and the American citizens, who's us? And so I think what we should look to for the federal and from the federal national level is clear, inspired action. The national stage should set the protocol, and we should allow states to modify as needed. But if you don't have something to start from, everybody's piecemealing from the bottom up. And what happens is you have misinformation from state to state. We were a month into this thing, and I was hearing one of the state governors say, I didn't know that you could have COVID and have no symptoms. And that was at least a month old information if you've been watching the news, depending on what state you were in. I was following COVID since the middle of December. And so I remembered when there were literally only 6 deaths, when even before that, we thought it couldn't make the species jump from animal to human. I remember when the numbers were coming out of China and people did not believe they were the actual numbers. And that was December. Yet here we are. We didn't really start talking about this until the end of February. Why were we so far behind? So I think there's a lot to be said for how things will have to be communicated in the future. And I do believe that the national role is to be the unifier and to put out a national strategy that allows states to modify it and customize it to meet them where they are. But I think we have to be unified from day one.
Sure. You asked the question, why were we so behind? If we were, why do you think so?
Well, here's the question you have to ask. If I'm a layperson and I'm following global news podcasts, international news, and I have all this information back in December, we have to believe that we had the access to the information in the federal government. I have to believe that a layperson shouldn't have more access than government officials. So that means either A, we knew about it and didn't take it as seriously as we should have, or we knew about it and did not know how to handle it. And I think what happened is we saw other countries come to us and say, hey, this thing is a big deal. Would you like our help? And you remember, I think it was Vice President Pence who said, no, we got it. We'll take it from here. We do things the American way. I think what we've stumbled off into is an age of isolationism that is harmful to us. There's middle ground. It's not globalization or isolation. It has to be that we find balance here. It would be reinventing the wheel, not to benefit from what China learned in the beginning, from what Iran learned in the beginning, and from what Italy learned in the beginning. Here we were starting from scratch. In our defense, we see other nations doing the same thing, starting from scratch as if they're just now finding about this epidemic. So I think we knew, and I think we didn't take it as seriously as we should have. And then I think that hampered our response because we decided to take it seriously much too late.
And now we have states that are beginning phased in reopenings of their economies, as they refer to them, Texas being one of them, a phased in reintroduction. Where do you stand there?
Well, first of all, there were guidelines that we're not following. You know, you're supposed to reopen after you have 2 weeks of a steady decline in cases. You have states opening at the height, opening at the peak without the testing in place. So what you're doing is you're taking people who look healthy, seem healthy, could possibly have the virus, and they're going back out into the public and reinfecting or infecting people. We don't know. This is a novel virus. There's still so much to learn. I talk a lot about pandemic proofing the nation, and that means that we now need to be engaged in what I call perennial preparation. You know, we should have been studying this and giving our healthcare workers up-to-date information as things change. There's so much we learned late in the game, and we're going to have to re-examine at the end. Did we lose people out of lack of knowledge, or did we lose them to COVID? That's going to be a tough discussion to have when this cloud clears.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've also seen, we spoke about the unemployment numbers and the impact COVID-19 has had there as far as the rate goes. But when those numbers are parsed through, you see who is being affected the most. You see 16.7% for Black workers, 18.9% for Hispanic or Latino workers, 16.2% for women. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that's the case? Does it speak to anything specific?
Of course it does. I mean, we get so, COVID happened and all of a sudden it was news that African Americans were more highly affected. And, you know, you get a collective eye roll often from the African American community because we know we were affected before COVID hit. So when you look at the demographics you just named, Black workers, Hispanic or Latino workers, or women, you're seeing higher rates there because they are the ones in the jobs that are most likely to disappear in rough times. You think about pay equity. You know, if women aren't being paid as much as men in the same positions, when it comes time to get rid of those positions, those are the ones that go. So we're seeing a disparity, not only in job pay, but you go back before that, you're seeing a disparity in education. You're seeing a disparity in training, and you're seeing a disparity in access. So you better believe when there's crisis, those areas that were already weakened will be exacerbated. And so one of my issues with reopening had nothing to do with the economy. It had to do with, have we taken the time in this reset to learn the lessons we need to do things differently on the other side? My fear was that we would reopen and try so desperately, as we keep saying, to go back to normal, when we know full and well normal wasn't serving us in the first place. So my concern right now is that we haven't taken the time to really learn the lessons of COVID to create systems that will be beneficial to us on the other side.
In some of my reporting here throughout the city of Houston, we spent a day looking at the city of Houston's opening of mobile testing sites in what are referred to as underserved communities, primarily communities of color throughout the city of Houston. And in speaking to community leaders there, primarily some area ministers, their perspective regarding the reopening of the economy was such that this is moving so quickly, in a sense that it seems as though elected leaders have forgotten about us, considering the rate at which the virus is impacting communities of color. What's your take on that?
So you were very polite in the way that you phrased that. I mean, you know, the discussion behind the scenes is, wait a minute. Seems like as soon as we realized COVID was disproportionately affecting African Americans, suddenly it was okay to reopen. And it seems like we're reopening with abandon. And, you know, that's a grave accusation to make, but I think it needs to be looked at, even if you think just even subconsciously. When we talk about policy having to, it should assess value. It should apply value to the people that the policy is for. And I think there's a great conversation that we need to have about how African American lives are valued in this country. You know, so I think we as a community, of course, need to do what we need to do as a community to make sure that we're taken care of, that we're taking care of ourselves. But I think there's a greater discussion to be had in our nation about how we as a nation value the various demographics. How do we honor each other? How do we value each other? And I think our actions sometimes speak much louder than our words.
This segues to another part of our conversation as we've got a few topics that we want to get through over the course of our hour-long conversation. And if you are joining us, we do welcome you this Meet the Candidates with Miss Jade Simmons, a candidate for the President of the United States. Thank you again, ma'am, for being with us this Saturday.
Thank you for giving me this much time. When we first started this journey a couple of months ago, we heard very pointedly from some media outlets. They said, "Are you Democrat or are you Republican?" And when I said I'm an independent, they said, "Well, we don't cover independents." And so, it's been a learning curve just to see that even in the area of media and journalism, we have become so used to the partisanship, used to the division, that we don't even know how to make space for voices that dare to say we believe there's common ground. So I thank you again for taking the time to hear me out.
Well, we thank you again for joining us. And as we continue, we'll go to Georgia's Attorney General, Chris Carr, in a statement to the Washington Post, as reported by the Washington Post. We'll be looking into how the case was handled from the onset. This, we're talking about the case of Ahmaud Arbery, the cell phone video that captured his shooting death. Late Thursday, the two men who confronted and shot Arbery were arrested and faced charges of murder and aggravated assault. But as I was saying, there are critics here who argue that local officials waited more than 2 months to make that arrest. The father and son say that they were defending themselves. You've seen the video. What does it show you?
So I'm going to be really transparent here and say that when this story broke, I refused to watch the video for a while. And it's because I felt like I knew what I was going to see. And I felt like it was deja vu all over again. I wrote an article years ago for the Huffington Post about the Trayvon Martin disaster. And so I felt like I was going to see the same thing. And sure enough, in preparation for our time together today, I said, well, I guess I'm going to have to watch this from beginning to end. And you asked, what did I see? I saw two guys pretending to be law enforcement, going out of their way to hunt down someone that they had already predetermined was guilty. They say he was on the side of a home under construction when I listened to the 911 call. And the lady asked him, well, what is he doing? Really, her question was, what wrong thing is he doing? And all I could say was, he's running. He's running down the street. There he goes. And they took it upon themselves to be law enforcement, to be judge, to be jury, and ultimately to be executioner. And I think that's what we saw a young boy gunned down, a young man gunned down in the streets. And there's no other way to say what we saw. We didn't see someone protecting their property. It'd be a different story if this was someone breaking into their home, running even off of their front yard. That's not what happened. They said this guy matched the description of, someone committing robbery in the area. When did they get a chance to see that he matched the description? We know already that so many court cases throw out eyewitness testimony because it's so inaccurate. But right there in that moment, they took everything upon themselves. Who gave them that right? And unfortunately, I believe that we have given them that right. Every time Trayvon Martin goes without justice, every time hashtag enter any name you want to.
So I want to pause you for a second, just for a point of clarification. When you say we have given them that right, who do you mean by they?
We have given the people who continue to do this kind of thing the right to do it. In this case, I'm talking about people who I believe are predisposed to be prejudiced against Black people. We have given them the right to be judge, jury, executioner, law enforcement, and that is a very dangerous thing. I think we opened the door with the Trayvon Martin case because it was so similar. And every time we don't see justice done, it is silent permission to protect your property, protect your neighborhood in that way.
Mm-hmm. It took over 70 days for charges to be filed against Gregory and Travis McMichael. Do you think that's time for an investigation to work itself out, or is that too long to wait, considering the video that we now know officials knew of before it was made public?
It's too long. It's too long. I mean, I think a week we would have already been saying it's too long. 70 days is too long. There's no excuse for it. I think we could put any other demographic in the place of Ahmaud, and it wouldn't have taken 70 days. And so again, it's an issue of value. I think we have a devaluing of humans in our society, and it's playing itself out in our criminal justice system. It's playing itself out in our political system. And so we are suffering the effects of silence and of lack of consequences where these issues are concerned. If average Americans are seeing law enforcement officials get off with these same crimes, why wouldn't they feel emboldened? Why wouldn't they feel like they had the right to protect themselves in the same way?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So under your administration, what would be the role of your Justice Department in addressing matters such as this? I mean, is this particular matter simply one of a violation of state law, or does it speak to a violation of one's federal civil rights?
I think on the surface, of course, it will be argued that this is a state's issue. But I think when you look at the Department of Justice, when they typically get involved is when you have mismanagement of a case. I think we can account for that. We can say this is 70 days of fumbled management. There's evidence that shows there was dereliction of duty. That always should require immediate oversight from the federal government. I know that Georgia law doesn't specifically provide hate crimes prosecutions. Well, there's an opening right there for a Department of Justice to step in. It's uniquely in a position to do just that. So I think we have to stop looking for excuses not to take these things as seriously as possible. I see this as a civil rights violation, and I think we need to have a period of taking these cases as deadly serious as they are deadly.
Based on what you've seen thus far, is this case being taken seriously?
Well, the question is, why hasn't this come to light before now? We talk about 70 days where it wasn't handled, but 70 days, we're only seeing about it in the media just now. I mean, even if you look at COVID-19, again, I've been following it since December, but it hasn't been in the media since December. And so I think it's a whole conversation that has to be had about what we prioritize. I think we need a new era now, again, like I keep saying, of having these difficult conversations, and we have to call a thing for what it is. I think we're seeing racism played out under the guise of protecting our personal property, under the guise of, trespassing. And we're looking for all these channels to exercise some of the greatest evils through. I saw a comment on Facebook. A white friend of mine was very disturbed by the video. He'd seen it, and he just posted about how tragic he thought it was. And someone else commented and said, why is this always a race thing? Evil is evil. And just right there, that minimizing of the fact that evil is only able to be executed if someone embodies and engages in evil. And then they direct that evil in a specific direction. In this case, we're seeing this directed at African Americans over and over and over again, and it needs to be addressed as such.
Okay. It's as president, I guess, how do you address it?
Well, I think you must start from a place of dialogue. Because we've been hunkered behind these party lines, you're not allowed to have real fruitful conversation. And so I think we first need a climate where we're not so worried that if we're blue, we're going to sound red if we say this thing, or if we're red, we're going to sound blue. And it keeps us from being able to talk in a way that I think is helpful. We must have civic dialogue. The current climate has been really good at restricting that type of conversation on both sides. And I think when you have that kind of restriction, it's very dangerous to the dialogue that needs to happen. And then I think you have to have very serious consequences to these crimes. I think we have to see, listen, I want to see there be more cohesion, collaboration, and understanding between law enforcement and minority communities. It's a travesty that we're seeing kids growing up in fear of law enforcement, or law enforcement working in fear of the communities, the people in the communities they serve. Here's the thing, that is not even close to the majority way of how law enforcement officials feel. We all know and love Some of us have policemen and policewomen who are family members. We know that they live to serve the communities they work in, but that's not what we see being highlighted in the media. So when we see corruption in law enforcement, we have to then see that corruption handled, or we further deepen the divide between these very important entities that need to be able to work together.
You write about that on your website, saying that you are pro-protection. You write, quote, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and of course, all lives matter. That's why we aim to make sure justice matters. Our policies aim to make Americans, our homes, our schools, our churches, our businesses, and our streets safer while delivering liberty and justice for all. We even have the gall to believe we can begin to repair the relationship between people of color and law enforcement. Tall, you ask the question, you know, tall order, sure. Where do you start?
Well, you know, one of the reasons I talk about justice mattering is because we talk about rhetoric again. We can't even get into the actual discussion because we're debating on what to call the issue. And so, like I say, the issue has to be, are we assuring that all Americans are safe? Meaning they're able to live out their life. They're able to jog wherever they want, not be in fear of being mistaken, you know, for a criminal worthy of death on the spot. We have to know that we can go about our everyday lives and complete the tasks, the jobs, the passions that we feel called to do without being in danger. And then we have to know that when we make mistakes, we are going to be punished according to the level of the crime, that we're not going to be disproportionately seeing penalties that don't match the crime. These are things that Americans need to be able to walk around knowing. You know, we have to know that my drug issue will be treated the same as your drug issue, that suddenly opioids won't be the only thing we talk about with compassion. But when you look at the criminalization of marijuana, of cocaine, of crack, that was a war on drugs. That was never talked about from a compassionate standpoint. And so we're seeing these examples of hypocrisy that never really get addressed at their core. We never really end up talking about the heart of the matter. And so when I talk about protection, I think we have to stop feeling like we're doing one thing without doing the other, that you can't reform the criminal justice system, but also look to make sure that law matters, that law is enforced. You know, we make it in the way that we've done so far in politics so that we can't talk about both things as entities that must work together. So I believe a lot of what I'm called to do right now in terms of restoration is restoring the conversation, being able to talk about issues that must go together instead of talking about them as if they can't go together.
Mm-hmm. A primary challenge to the conversation of challenging the system as it is providing a successful counter argument to a stable, often referred to as old white men, if we're going to be frank about it. Mm-hmm. But how do you successfully offer an olive branch to the other side who believes as though they're being threatened, that conversations are aligned within the realm of you have privilege and as a result, I'm at a disadvantage? How do you convince them?
You know, it's what I was saying earlier. I'm sorry, you cut off right there. What's the last part?
That they're not being attacked.
Yeah, listen, I think that one of the reasons people ask why, Republicans accuse me of being a closet Democrat. Democrats accuse me of being a closet Republican, which tells me I'm doing something right.
And I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like certain parts of the conversation, like my messy ears thinking, okay, well that sounds okay. Well then that's there. Okay, so what? But yes.
Yeah. But the truth is, when you sit down and have a lunchtime conversation with a friend, and you talk about all these issues, you really find out there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of room to maneuver. That's what I'm saying we need to be having out in public. Now, out in public, we go, you don't say that because we're blue, or you don't say that because we want to turn the country red. Listen, no one's going to probably ever, I'm trying to find the best way to say this. When I look at when Hillary Clinton ran in 2016, one of the biggest mistakes that I saw is in her attempt to really use President Obama's election model. She didn't even talk to white people. She didn't really worry about the issues that were going on amongst poor whites, amongst Rust Belt factory workers. She didn't really worry about it. Now, if you're on the other side, you start to feel like, wait a minute, all the attention, all the benefits, all the programs are going for the other. And they rightfully felt left out. And I think Bill Clinton was trying to counsel her to, hey, you gotta broaden this message here. You gotta reach everybody. There's something very dangerous when politicians take one side for granted. And I think we see that very thing going on right now. On the left, I do feel like the African-American vote is taken for granted. I feel like it's entitled. It feels entitled to our vote. And what happens is whenever, no matter what side you're on, whenever politicians are entitled to your vote, there's no need for them to actually follow through on doing things that are in your behalf. You know, we don't want to see any more politicians who only talk to us when it's election season. We want to see that follow through. And so I do believe, because I work in situations where I'm amongst so many different types, you know, I work a lot of times I'm speaking to a room full of white men. And I know that they're not all evil. They're not all out, you know, to get us. But if you listen to one side or the other, that's the rhetoric you hear. So I think we now need a table that we can come around and have representation and be able to really hear out the concerns of each demographic, because there are. Here's what identity politics is. Identity politics to me is when you manipulate your message to appeal to a demographic for the purpose of getting their vote. I think that's wrong. What I think is powerful and important is talking about and addressing the needs of specific demographics, because they are unique. They are different. They come with different cultural challenges. They have a different historical background. I don't think it's wrong to say, look, we need to address the needs of this demographic. But I think it's wrong when we pit those demographics against each other and make them feel like if we address your needs, we can't address the other side. And I think that's exactly what we've been seeing in politics up until this point.
You know, I wonder, in this era in which we find ourselves, there is an election in November, but there isn't a lot of talk about it just because of where we are in the midst of this era. But how is your message being received? But also, what's it like to campaign right now? I've got to imagine that the playing field's kind of been evened out ever so slightly.
Yeah, you know, it's ironic in a way, right? You know, we've all been grounded. A large part of my revenue in my business comes from being able to gather in public with thousands of people. So that was shut down almost immediately. And we had just launched all these campaign events that we weren't able to do. And so we moved everything online. I actually see there being an advantage, because I keep saying communication is going to be so important. And I hope that Americans are watching their leaders communicate. I hope they are listening to what they're really saying in order to discern what they really value. Keep saying any good leader, they're only going to, bad or good, they're going to lead how they've always lived. And so I think when you look at the president right now, he's leading how he's always lived. People say, well, I elected him because he was a businessman. Well, what kind of businessman was he? Because that's the kind of businessman he's going to be in office. So when you look at what my record is, you'll have to look at what kind, you know, of servant leader was she? What was she doing before? What was she prioritizing? I was always prioritizing transformation, always prioritizing people, always prioritizing purpose, wanting people individually to be able to elevate to whatever the next best, biggest and boldest iteration of themselves was that was possible. The same that I want for the nation. So I feel like being in this virtual sphere gives me an opportunity to communicate actually to a lot of people, and we can talk to different states and tailor messages to address their specific needs. We just had a session with educators, a session with healthcare workers. So I'm able to really learn from people in real time, and I'm not just talking at them, I'm learning from them. So I'm excited about what this change in levels has provided. I think it's going to play out very well in the end.
And by that, you mean it's allowed you a greater opportunity for reach, where you would really be expected to fly somewhere you're not right now.
That's right. And even in terms of the number of appearances that you can do, you know, you can sit in front of the computer all day and do back-to-back appearances, back-to-back sessions where that wasn't logistically as possible. Of course, you do it, but you still wouldn't reach as many as you're in line to reach. But I think, like you said, the conversation will steer back around to the election when the time is right. And we're just set ourselves up so that when the eyes start to come, people can know that they hear my heart, and that they're hearing that I would be a president who doesn't believe she has to run for the people. I think we need someone now that is running with us, that is living the same life we're living, so that they're leading from a place of powerful perspective.
Yeah, there are a lot of parents out there who are wondering about the future of their child's education as school districts nationwide figure out what to do in terms of making up for lost time. School districts nationwide are shuttered amid the coronavirus pandemic, and that has some advocates of at-risk youth, low income, primarily from communities of color, at greater disadvantage. What has the coronavirus pandemic, you think, revealed about our public education system, for instance, and how would your administration address concerns of inequality that were present prior to, but have been brought to the fore now, for instance, access to internet or computer to do work at home?
You know, you had the conversation about socialism earlier. You know, there are all these things that we kept telling people we couldn't give them. Suddenly, we made it possible. Suddenly, we had computers in the hands of kids who need it. In rural areas, suddenly we had internet for kids who needed it. I was talking to a teacher earlier today. I was meeting with a group of educators, and she was saying one of the pain points for her was that teachers need more training. I'm talking about post their academic education, that in the workforce, they needed to be able to have training that helps them adjust to the different evolving demographics that they're having to serve. They need cultural training to be able to address the specific needs. There we go again with identity, right? The specific needs of the kids that they're teaching from different communities. So one of the things that I'm proud of is that we'll be leading with a restorative platform for education that does what we all found out the hard way. We are about to value teachers like never before. Every parent went into shock when suddenly we had to become the teacher. I think it was Shonda Rhimes who said, let's pay them like $1 million right away. So there has to be an elevation of the value of teachers again. We have to pay them more. Suddenly standardized tests weren't that important again in COVID. We let that go by the wayside, but we've been hearing we have to have standardized tests. How many millions of dollars that we spend on standardized testing could we be putting into paying our teachers more? So you'll hear me talk a lot about championing for teachers having an increase in value, not just in terms of inspirational talk and how we talk about them, but how we pay them. Again, you talked about the inequality, the inequity and access. There's going to be a huge conversation growing about kids with special abilities. I know firsthand the challenge of finding the right schools for kids who have needs that are different, who have abilities that are different. And it's a shame that we can go in one district and have an abundance of opportunity, an abundance of accommodations, and not have the same. I believe in cultivating what I call a dream team for students and a dream team for teachers who right now are wearing too many hats. I believe we're on par now because of COVID, because of the silver lining that parents got to know their kids as students. They got to understand differently the challenges of teaching. Inherently now we value teachers more. It's prime time to make this be a pivotal discussion. And my administration would champion teachers like never before.
Part of that debate also, and you touched on this, which is why I'm bringing it up, part of it centers on how school districts are funded. So how states fund public education. For instance, here in Texas, there's the big debate over what's called the Robin Hood tax, for instance. Districts deemed property tax rich, funding those deemed property tax poor, but the debate there not taking into account poorer districts within those so-called rich districts and what that means in terms of access to the student. What's your take on that, and what's the conversation nationally?
We were just talking again right before this call with a group of educators, and we were talking about the subject of choice. And again, you mentioned how we can frame a discussion to have it sound like we want it to sound and make it more attractive than it really is. As a parent, you think of choice and you go, yeah, I want the choice to send my kid wherever I need to send my kid. As someone who's had to make choices for her kids and piecemeal programs that will match them where they are, meet them where they are, you initially think we need to have choice. But the discussion is the choice we're giving some taking choices away from others? That is the actual conversation. Most Americans, if they're not involved, if they don't have the possibility of choice and aren't trying to get their kids in schools that they can choose, they don't know that there are all these restrictions for who can go to those schools. So then you have kids who can either afford, who either test a certain way, who have a certain score, can go to these schools and have choice. And then it leaves behind underfunded schools with less resources, and you have kids left behind with no choice. So I do think that we have to be very careful that as we provide options, I believe in options, and I think parents have to provide a lot of those options ourselves. We have to make sure we're funding public schools to be able to compete and to put out an educated population that's not at a disadvantage because they couldn't afford the choice or test into the choice.
And most certainly, time flies when you're having fun. It's
Yeah.
We're getting to that point where I'm going to be told, Brandon, shut up. It's time.
I know.
So I just want to just rapid fire. There's so much that I really wanted to get to, but it was a very thorough conversation. I just want to ask you real quick, and it's really unfair to shape it as such, but healthcare, what's your pitch? Go.
Yeah. Okay. The trivia minute. Okay. So right. Healthcare, here's where we need to be. You have to have healthcare for all. Nobody would argue that. I think you have to have Medicare for more. I think we should move the Medicare age down to 55, have people be able to buy in as well. 60, have that be included automatically, but at 55, be able to buy into that. What that does is people talk about the cost of that. You're now having younger, healthier Americans participate in funding that program, so it's not all government funded, but then you also need to raise the eligibility for Medicaid. I also believe that we should look at a state public option, but I believe we have to test things to know if they really work. So I believe you roll out public options in states first, where you start where you have really impoverished communities that also have places where there are insurance monopolies. Start there. Let's see how this works. Here's my concern. As we begin to expand healthcare, which we must do, I want to make sure we don't expand inequality, so that as we begin to give people more, we're able to give it to them at the highest quality. I don't want to make it so that people who get free healthcare are getting worse healthcare. That's really important to me, to make sure that we don't unintentionally build in inequity to the system. But I think we have to have a new conversation. Let me end with this. You look at the Sixth Amendment, Brandon, and it allows us the right to a speedy trial, a free attorney if we get into any trouble with the law. We can be guilty of sin. We still get that free attorney. Nobody argues that. When you think about a right to life, why is there not more access to healthcare for all? Isn't healthcare how we take care of our lives? So I think if you don't think of our constitutional founders as socialists, we don't think of them that way. Yet they said we should have a right to these things. So I think we have to have a new discussion on what a right to life really means and where healthcare comes in that conversation. And I know if nothing else, we have to do what we can to ensure more Americans and make being able to pay for their own healthcare possible as well.
State public option, that made my ears peak. What would ultimately be the outcome of that as far as the national conversation is concerned?
Yeah, I think, I believe that we have to test things to see how they work and how they actually play out. And so I get excited about testing an area to see what the benefits are, to see where the numbers turn. If we throw away, if you repeal Obamacare, you throw millions instantly back into the uninsured pool. So that's never an option. And so I think we start also by looking at Obamacare and the areas that need to be tweaked. I think we look at day one being able to lower prescription costs. I think we look at more coverage for things like diabetes medicine. You look at these demographics that are affected specifically, and you build parts of the program that address the greatest needs. So when we talk about that public option, I'm excited to see what a practice rollout looks like, and so that we can look at the system, tweak it before we roll it out nationwide.
And we're at the 1 minute mark, but I don't think we'll get into too much trouble if we go over a little bit. So just walk us through, what's next for the campaign in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, tonight we're actually, I've run very openly with my faith out front. And that's a risky thing right now, because I do believe, that faith has gotten a bad rap in the last 4 years, because it's really been hijacked on the right, I should say. And I really want people to see what it looks like to have faith in public services. It doesn't have to be a big thing. And so tonight we're doing in honor of the National Day of Prayer. We're airing a bunch of prayer interviews we've been doing with influencers in the faith-based world, talking about their journey during COVID. This is a time where more people than ever are looking for inspiration, they're looking for hope. And we also kick off 50 days of prayer for the nation, praying for each state every day, starting with Alabama today. So this is something I say openly because I'm unashamed to say I believe that this is a nation that has a destiny. I believe we are designed to be one nation under God and indivisible. And I don't think that that has to be a scary proposition. I'm excited to show that there can be leaders who can honor those who believe differently, who think differently. And honor doesn't have to be doesn't have to be agreement. A friend of mine just said that. It doesn't have to be agreement. It just means that I can actually look at you and see value in you as a human because I believe that you're a child of God. And so I'm excited that we're leading with that. We'll be online just about every day in different facets. We have a One Nation listening tour. We hit all the hot topics so people can become more familiar with where I stand on all of the issues. So I thank you again, Brandon, for having me.
I thank you so much for spending the past hour with us, ma'am. Again, Miss Jade Simmons, a candidate for president, independent candidate for president. We thank you for spending time with us. A pledge to give voice to the muted middle class, as you referred to them, right? The
muted middle.
Muted middle.
Right, all classes. But
yes.
The muted.
Tell me more about that.
You know, this is a demographic that I think is the largest demographic in the country. I think most of the country is inherently independent, and yet you don't hear our views represented. You don't hear people often, Brandon, that you have to wonder whether or not they're Republican or Democrat. You usually know right off the bat when they start talking. And I think most of America wants common ground and believes there is some. And I'm standing in that gap saying we're here and we believe we can work together more than we can't.
All right. Well, ma'am, we do look forward to seeing you out there on the campaign trail. Best of luck to you as you push forward to November.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
And we thank you all for joining us here. This conversation, Meet the Candidates, Miss Jade Simmons with the Houston Association of Black Journalists. I'm Brandon Walker with the organization reporter at KPRC Channel 2, part of a day of conversations we are having here. So we hope that you're enjoying what you see. And we do hope that you go and learn more about Miss Jade Simmons. Ma'am, we'll give you the final word. Where can we go find out more about you?
You can learn more about where we stand. That's operationrestoration2020.com. Follow us as well at the same handle on Facebook. I look forward to interacting with you personally.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend.